Owen, welcome to the RSA.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic to have you here as part of this time's journal, which is about courageous governance and how best we achieve courageous governance. I'm thrilled to be able to draw on your experience of thinking about different models of governance, different models of democracy, and how we make them work. And I wondered whether we could kick off by asking you a very general question, actually, as an expert on these matters, which is, what do we even mean by this word democracy that we bandy around all the time?
A small question to start with. Thanks. Well, I mean, it's not something anybody agrees on, but I mean, generally, I think what we mean is that the people have some sort of input into decision making. And there are various ways in which they can have input into decision making. And we normally think of it now in kind of modern societies as representative democracy, where every 4 or 5 years people have input into the decision making through the election of a parliament, which then chooses a government, or the election of an executive. So that's the basis that we now understand of with democracy. But of course, then there are problems with that, because once every 4 or 5 years is probably not enough for most people, and it's probably not ideal for decision makers either, that they are just kind of sent off to Parliament and kind of don't get feedback along the way.
And you use the words there, representative democracy. How would that differ then, that model differ from a model I know you've had huge experience on, which is deliberative democracy? How do the two things sort of fit together? How are they different?
Well, so representative democracy is essentially us as citizens sending people to Parliament to govern on our behalf, and they represent us. And there's lots of different ways in which they can represent us. Deliberative democracy, I suppose, in a general sense, all democracy probably should be deliberative. So normatively, we'd like to think that when we're making decisions, when in, say, the House of Commons or in the Cabinet Office, our decisions are being made on our behalf, that they are deliberating, that they're kind of thinking rationally, coming up with reasons for the decision, that it's not just, their gut, or it's not just something that they, representing their interests. And so the idea of deliberation is something that very few people could object to, that we talk about it, we think about it, and we expressly provide reasons for our decisions.
Got it. So that could involve just parliamentarians,
yes,
but could also engage citizens directly in that process of deliberation.
Yeah, so now when we talk about deliberative democracy, a lot of the time we're thinking about probably these things called mini publics, where we take usually a random sample of people, put them in a room for a day, a week, or weekends over the course of a year, and ask them to think about a subject in a pretty intense way that most normal people don't normally think about subjects like that. And I suppose one of the advantages of doing so is that it gives us a sense of an idea that this is how ordinary people would think about a topic if they actually thought about it. So this is what they would, if they were exposed to, different arguments for and against an issue, that they would, and if they were forced to deliberate, to talk with other people who maybe don't hold the same views as them, then after that they would maybe form a consensus, maybe change their minds or maybe not change their minds, but you would have a sense at least of what are the sorts of ideas, what are the things that would come up, and what a ordinary member of the public would think had they thought about it in that sort of intense way.
I want to come back to this. I know you've been living the dream on this sort of model in Ireland and learnt a lot en route. But presumably, from what you say, having this fora where different perspectives can be put and debated, deliberated, maybe consensus sought, might be particularly useful for issues where there's otherwise deep divisions or disagreements about what the right course might be.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's probably not an ideal method of making a decision, say, for technical things. So, I mean, if you were to think about, should we introduce quantitative easing or not? Yeah. Probably getting 100 ordinary people into a room and having, a couple of economists kind of slug it out in front of them, probably not really, it's not an ideal way to make that decision. Maybe they should stay in a room and make the decision themselves, the economists. Whereas if you have maybe moral issues where there's no one is right or wrong, we have different value judgments, and we kind of come to a question, kind of maybe quite sure of what we feel and not terribly understanding of what maybe our opponents feel. Something like a deliberative forum will be useful to air different perspectives so that anybody will get ideas from the other side. They'll understand why they object. And so in those, and hopefully then you can, if not achieve a consensus, at least achieve some sort of compromise or some sort of position where more people are happier than not. Or, I mean, another way of thinking about it might be to think in terms of losers' consent, that the people who lose the battle on that issue at least feel that they have been listened to, they consent to having lost and won't kind of bring it up again and again and again. And so that idea of losers' consent is maybe important in deliberative democracy, that you have a group who maybe don't win the majority, they don't form a majority, but at least their position is respected and reflected in some ways in the outcome that's been decided.
That's very interesting. And let's explore that notion of losers' consent maybe later on. It's not one I've come across actually, so it's really fascinating as a way of helping put issues to rest when they're intrinsically very contentious. Before digging in a bit deeper though on the experience in Ireland, we hear banded around quite a lot now the sense that democracy might be under threat. We hear words like democratic recession. There's a re-tilting of the political playing field away from democracy, perhaps towards more populist or authoritarian regimes. What's your sense of that? Whether you think it's happening, how fragile you think our democracies are to that tilt?
Well, it's definitely happening. When we can see in countries in the European Union, Hungary, for instance, and Poland, there was that is that sort of retrenchment away from ordinary democracy or working democracy. We can also see in opinion polling that younger generations are less attached to democracy. They say they're less attached to democracy than older generations. So those generations of the boomers, the ones born immediately after the war, they are probably the most attached. I think our generation probably still pretty attached, but younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, do declare that their attachment to democracy is not as strong and not as intrinsic, possibly because they don't believe that it's delivering for them, and maybe in the way that it delivered for our generations. And so there probably is a threat to democracy. And we can see that, I think we can see to some extent in the UK the way in which the civil service has been sort of hollowed out a little bit here, that what we thought were institutions that were rock solid and built in stone can suddenly crumble or at least weaken when populist politicians come along and start to blame the judiciary or the civil service or whatever the blob is called on that day. And, it does weaken things. And so I'm not sure that what we may have, certainly when I grew up, I perceived democracy as kind of rock solid, and this is something that is not up for grabs. It's not even open to debate. It probably looks like it is open to debate, and it is probably weaker than I would have previously thought.
Fascinating. Which really puts the onus on us, collective us, I mean, not just you and I, to think imaginatively about ways in which democracy can be strengthened, or ways in different flavours of democracy that we might try to try and kind of rebuild the case if it's been damaged by events, by not delivering, perceived as being not delivering for a great many people, especially younger people who've had it probably tougher than most over the last couple of decades. Which is, I think, is a great segue to your own work in Ireland. And I want to start, if not at the very beginning, then early on. When you were setting up this body, We the Citizens in Ireland, what were your reasons for doing that, and what was the model you had in mind?
It was basically in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which it affected Ireland more deeply than most other places. And we noticed a couple of things about policymaking before and after that. One was that in advance of the crash in Ireland, there had been voices in academia and in kind of civil society which had been saying that the government's financial policies are kind of suicidal, that we have pro-cyclical, we're pumping money into a property market that is already fairly overheated, and that it's not going to end well. Those voices weren't listened to really at all, and we kind of thought, how do we get those voices listened to? The other problem was that in the aftermath of the crisis, we could see that the government was going to be forced to make some pretty difficult decisions. And with those difficult decisions, there was a potential for the Irish people to kind of not quite revolt. In the end, we kind of dealt with it pretty stoically, but there was this potential that the government would be introducing new property taxes, say, or water charges, things like that, and that if the population just said, no, we're not having it, the government was going to be in a very difficult position. And so part of it was then to kind of think, what are the policies that will be acceptable to the people? What are the ones that won't be acceptable? And how would we find out about this, more than just doing an opinion poll, for instance, where you don't really get a considered opinion? So a colleague of ours in Canada in British Columbia, had been thinking about introducing a new electoral system, and they had used a citizens' assembly there. We took that idea, we had spoken to him about it, and we took that idea, took it to a philanthropist who agreed to fund pretty much just an experiment where we brought 100 people into a room over a weekend and got them to think about things like, difficult decisions where there's difficult trade-offs about, should we introduce a property tax or not, or should we introduce water charges or not? And in doing that, we at least we got a sense that this was a worthwhile experience, because you had people thinking about, ordinary citizens thinking about the sort of trade-offs that were involved in introducing a property tax or not introducing a property tax. And so it probably would make it easier for politicians to make those decisions, knowing that, after a debate, ordinary people think this, or kind of this is acceptable, or maybe even after a debate, they still, there's no way they would want something like water charges, for instance. And so we thought it was a useful idea. There was also a sense that the political system itself had failed, and maybe there are different things that we would want to change. Some people had been kind of opposed to the Irish electoral system, and they thought that the Irish electoral system produced a kind of uniquely localist type of public representative who didn't consider policy kind of broad national policy questions. And so then we also kind of said we could use this as a way to consider different forms of government, or, changing the electoral system, or various other things like that.
And that experiment, it sounds like it must have been pretty successful, because you managed to convince the government not long after that to embark on a couple of citizens' assemblies on some big and contentious issues in Ireland around same-sex marriage and around abortion in 2015 and 2018. You said a bit about how you got from your initial weekend away to these two national issues being debated first by citizens and then by referendum?
Well, I suppose we got lucky to some extent in that the 2011, we'd done this in 2010, and there was an election in 2011 where there was a new coalition government between a centre-right Fine Gael party and a centre-left Labour party, who both knew that, you know, there were difficult times ahead, and they were probably in need of some way out of problems that they had in forming their coalition agreement, and so they could not agree. The Labour Party insisted on wanted to have something on same-sex marriage. Fine Gael was kind of more conservative and it didn't want to do anything on that, and so we had kind of arrived with a present which they said, okay, that's an immediate way out of our problem. Yeah. So they could just say, okay, we can send it to a citizens' assembly. And so there was this constitutional convention was set up that considered about 5 or 6 different issues. And the initial one was unusual in that it had 66 citizens and 33 actually elected politicians. And that was quite successful in the sense that you had this mix of the two, and when the elected politicians went back to their normal day jobs of being parliamentarians, they had kind of come away from that experience having worked kind of fairly intensely, spoken fairly intensely to citizens about some of these issues. They kind of came away kind of thinking these are issues that maybe we could or should address. And so, for instance, same-sex marriage was one of them. It was a fairly contentious issue, but not deeply, deeply contentious at the time. But it did probably have an impact. It sped up the process. You know, the citizens, you had different groups coming in, you know, kind of lesbian and gay representatives kind of telling their story. And so there was this sense that you get to hear, in policy making, you get to hear people's lived experiences. And so this idea of people's lived experiences came to the forefront. You also had a lot of the different groups kind of spoke to each other. You had religious groups that were opposed to it. You had the groups in favour of it. And they were kind of forced to address each other to some extent as well. You got to tease out some of the potential difficulties. For instance, you know, if you are introducing same-sex marriage, what would that mean for teachers in schools? Are they allowed to kind of object to having to teach about marriage in the way that maybe doesn't cohere with their beliefs? And so things like that got teased out in ways, not always solved, but at least they kind of came to the fore, and those politicians then were able to kind of go back and say, okay, these are the issues that people have, these are the ones that aren't really issues, and these are the things that we probably should just leave alone, and these are the ones where maybe we can kind of fire ahead on.
And that then paved the way for a referendum on the topic in a way. It provided the terms of reference for that referendum.
Yeah, so it paved the way for the referendum on same-sex marriage, which then was passed fairly easily, even though everybody was a little queasy about it because, you know, Ireland, we still have even that kind of self-image of ourselves as being a relatively conservative Catholic country. That link had been broken already, but, you know, there were still concerns among the political classes that, you know, the church could suddenly just kind of rise up and could make this difficult. And so I think it probably did help the political classes to kind of see that, you know, we have nothing to fear from a referendum on this issue. So then with abortion, that was an even more difficult question. There was a kind of a deeper, really quite deep division within our society. So much so that, you know, for about 30 years, politicians had just steered clear of the topic completely. They didn't want, I mean, I spoke to many Liberal senior politicians who just said, I mean, I don't want to name the word abortion on the same newspaper page as my name. It just is not going to gain me any votes, and all it has the potential is to cause me trouble. So politicians had steered clear of it. The courts ended up having to do a lot of the policy making with difficult cases, and there was really not a huge amount of appetite for anybody to deal with this issue. There was this kind of focusing event, the death of a woman in a hospital in Galway in the west of Ireland, where it was probably likely that had she been able to procure an abortion, she would not have died. But she kind of died in agony in that hospital, where allegedly the clinician said, "We can't do this, we can't save your life." And so that then it became an issue again. And politicians probably became more open to now at least talking about it. But the idea of a citizens' assembly was something that was kind of irresistible in a way, because it allowed them to stand back somewhat, because it wasn't a partisan issue. The parties didn't really divide on it, on things, so it wasn't going to be something that the Parliament necessarily could direct them on. And so they set up a citizens' assembly on abortion, and it met over almost the course of almost a year. It heard from lots of different people, from kind of psychiatrists, psychologists, the medical clinicians, various different groups, and it ended up recommending what was a much more liberal regime than would have been expected. And the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament, more or less repeated that exercise. They invited more or less the same people in front of a parliamentary committee and discussed it. And what you then again saw was a lot of pretty conservative parliamentarians changed their minds, just as a lot of pretty conservative citizens had changed their mind as a result of the Citizens' Assembly. And so it was then put to the people in a referendum. There was concern that in a referendum there could be some slippage of in support of this, but a lot of people kind of felt that the Citizens' Assembly gave the decision some kind of democratic legitimacy. It had been seen that a lot of people who had felt kind of maybe iffy on the subject, because there were, still a lot of people with strong opinions about it, and there was a sense that the Citizens' Assembly gave it that legitimacy. It probably helped to some extent in passing the referendum, but what it almost certainly did, and I think the most important thing that the Citizens' Assembly did, was that it steeled politicians. It gave them a bit of steel where they were able to kind of say, "I'm not afraid to go to the public on this issue," where they had to always be very cheerful. And so they were now kind of felt able to talk about topics and about the topic, and were able to also anticipate what people's objections would be. And, it probably helped the referendum campaign to some extent, because they had a sort of rehearsal with 100 people, just in private. And so that did help that referendum campaign, and it was probably a more dignified affair than it may have otherwise been had there not been the Citizens' Assembly.
It's really fascinating. It's not an aspect I thought about at all, Eoin, but the role of assemblies, citizen assemblies, in fortifying politicians to take on rather than duck issues that otherwise were seen as being divisive or difficult, and that experience sounds really positive. You mentioned earlier on, I was going to ask you, for those two assemblies and then referenda on same-sex marriage and on abortion, to what extent did they help achieve that losers' consent you mentioned earlier on? I'm guessing the Catholic Church didn't change its mind on either issue necessarily, but their voice was heard, they had been listened to. Was there a sense of them having given consent?
Yeah, so you're right, they didn't change their mind. And if you came into that argument, into that debate against abortion, you probably still left it against abortion. Some people did change their mind. Some Catholic parliamentarians said that they had changed their mind, that while they were still personally opposed to abortion, they were now open to the idea that we should legislate for it and to impose their will on other people. Yeah. And so I think there was that kind of losers' consent, in that you felt that the whole process from the Citizens' Assembly to the parliamentary debate to the referendum meant that there was legitimacy in the outcome, that people had talked about it, their voices had been heard, and while they may not have won, there's nobody kind of saying that, well, we need to reopen this debate again.
So far so good. You've laid the ground with the citizens. It's then been taken forward successfully as a process onto hugely contentious issues in Ireland, same-sex marriage and abortion, with the assemblies paving the way for a referendum that's gone the way of the citizens' assemblies. That's only part of the story, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because more recent experience of using both has been rather more mixed. And could you say a little bit about that and what you've learned from that experience about when they work well and perhaps also when they work a bit less well?
Yeah. So even though we can argue that they worked pretty well in delivering, say, the debate about same-sex marriage and abortion, one of the things we did find out, for instance, by accident, as it turned out, in We the Citizens, was that people are quite open to manipulation, and these processes are easy to manipulate. And so by accident, we had thought we had a left-wing economist and a right-wing economist to consider the idea of property taxes. And we thought that the left-wing one was going to oppose the property tax and the right-wing one or kind of proposed the other way around. But anyway, they both were in favour of it. And we had what was about 80% of people, the citizens that we had kind of gathered, had been opposed to property taxes. And that reversed. After hearing from two experts, we had 80% in favour of property taxes.
Right.
And we realised, they didn't actually get to hear any of the opposing views.
Interesting.
And the same thing sort of happened in the actual Citizens' Assembly on the electoral system. Partly, I suspect, because we were in favour of maintaining the Irish electoral system, and partly because, we couldn't find experts who were arguing against it. We had a sort of a fairly lukewarm person who was opposing giving the arguments against the Irish electoral system. And again, we could see that people were willing to blame the Irish electoral system for lots and lots of things. And then after having heard the experts in favour of it and then the lukewarm one opposing it, they kind of changed their minds. And so we can see that people, when they hear experts, tend to agree. And so it's open to manipulation, because if they don't hear strongly opposing views, they will just go with whatever the experts say, and that appears to be the case. And so in some of the more recent citizens' assemblies that we have had in Ireland, for instance, we had one on gender equality.
Right.
Now, the idea of gender, I think one of the things we need to do when you're having a citizens' assembly is have something that is a specific question and maybe a difficult question. So, and maybe one where, people's values might differ somewhat. Gender equality was neither specific nor difficult. If you're asked, are you in favour of gender equality? Nobody's going to say no. Right. Even if they are opposed to it, you're just going to say, of course you are. And so the government had wanted to introduce, some policies on gender equality. We also had, in the Irish Constitution, there was a fairly old-fashioned clause in it which said that mothers in the home provide great service to the state and to the family, and so their position should be supported by the state. And a lot of people, not unreasonably, found that somewhat sexist and archaic. And so there was, people wanted to have that removed. The Gender Equality Citizens' Assembly, however, it became a little like a sort of module in moderate feminism from a sociology department. It didn't really
get into some of the arguments for and against. I mean, you could, for instance, make arguments about marriage. One of the aspects that they were discussing was the position of marriage in the Constitution. And you could make reasonable arguments that marriage as an institution supports children and et cetera, and maybe it's something that the state should want to support. But none of those views were heard in the Citizens' Assembly because the experts were all of one opinion. Equally, the same, we could see the same on the issue of childcare. You could reasonably argue that children benefit from having one parent staying at home. It's usually the mother, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And that is a debate that, we can see academics having, and mainly in the US, not so much in Europe. And there are arguments for and against whether, we'd be better off with families that have one parent working and one parent staying at home rather than what has become the norm in Europe of two parents working. But again, that issue wasn't addressed, and it was all, we have to pay for childcare. We have to do more to support mothers into work. And the outcome of this Citizens' Assembly was more or less kind of a manifesto of and a wish list of nice things that we could have. We might want to support women being able to do this, and this, and the government should fund this, and the government should fund more childcare, and the government should fund things.
Right.
And one of the advantages, I think, of a Citizens' Assembly is that it asks the citizens to confront difficult questions. Questions that policymakers have to confront, where you have real trade-offs.
Yeah.
You can't have this and this. You have to decide, is it this or is it this? Or if you're going to want to do this, you're going to have to increase taxes, or you're going to have to take money from somewhere else to pay for it. And none of those trade-offs were answered of the citizens in this. So I think they produced 80 or 90 recommendations, which all required more money. Everybody was in favour of them, and no trade-offs, no difficult questions were asked of them. So I think if you are going to do a Citizens' Assembly, you need to have hard questions.
Yeah. So pressing a little what you've said, which is fascinating from your experience of kind of what works and, as importantly, what doesn't work. It's all about design. It's all about whether these assemblies, these deliberative techniques are a good thing or a less good thing, hinges crucially on the way in which they're brought together. And some of that is about having a precise enough question. Without a precise question, you'll get a very general set of responses to it. Part of it is about having a question where there genuinely is some choices, difficult choices to be made, because life and policy invariably is about choices. If you're doing more of this, you're probably doing less of that. And the third thing I heard you say is, in the course of making those difficult choices, to have both sides represented. Certainly if you are to bring experts to the table to inform the debate, then you need two-sided experts that can speak to both sides of the trade-off in equally animated terms. Would that be a fair way of sort of summarising how to make these things more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely to be a success than a failure?
Yes, no, I think that they are probably the key things that you want to have, and so we can see that there are some examples. I mean, in Scotland, they had a Citizens' Assembly on the future of Scotland, which was a master class in how not to do it.
Right.
Because the future of Scotland is any given. And what happened was that they produced huge numbers of recommendations, mainly to have more and more Citizens' Assemblies, because they were being spoken to by experts in Citizens' Assemblies who, to a large extent, are evangelists for the process. And you just have vaguely nice things that we want more inclusive, more equal Scotland in the future, which is of no use to policymakers and is really of no use to anybody.
Right.
Anybody could have told you that in advance, and so it kind of wasted everybody's time, really.
So I want to ask you a bit about what your advice, on the basis of this fantastic experience, having been there at the inception in Ireland and having seen successes and seen more recently examples of how not to do it. What your advice, I'm asking you about what your advice would be to the Irish government today about, do you keep on going with a redesign or not? And I ask you the same question about the UK government, because we've got an election coming up here in the UK, and some of the parties actually have flirted a little bit with the idea of these things. But let's start with the Irish government, who've been living through this over, getting on for 10 years now.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the enthusiasm has probably run out in Ireland for these, certainly in the Irish government.
Right.
The enthusiasm has sort of ebbed away, mainly because of the experience in the most recent referendum on marriage and the family. There was a sense that, these aren't quite the panacea that everybody had kind of said that they were, that they could kind of take on difficult issues. So I suppose the advice to the Irish government would be, if you're going to do it, don't just kind of think difficult issue, we don't want to deal with, let's call a citizens' assembly.
Right.
So there is this kind of almost Pavlovian reaction that, I don't want to make a decision on this, let's call it citizens' assembly. If you are doing a citizens' assembly, make sure that, as you've kind of summarized nicely, make sure it's specific, make sure that there are difficult choices. So it has to be hard, and make sure that you're hearing both sides of the argument. And so there probably aren't that many issues that are going to work for that. And I mean, so maybe some of them that are there is, say, the future of a united Ireland. Because, I mean, one of the things that they possibly have been useful at is agenda setting. So we actually discover when you have these conversations with ordinary people who are asking questions that maybe experts don't ask because they're experts and they think they know everything. And ordinary people will probably have to find a way of teasing out things that wouldn't necessarily come up among senior civil servants or politicians. And so as a way of sort of interrogating an issue and finding what are going to be the things that people like or object to, what are the problems with any potential proposal, it mightn't be a bad idea to run one of these. There are problems, though, when it becomes almost as if they're legitimate in and of themselves. So in the aftermath of the Irish Gender Equality Citizens' Assembly, there were complaints that the government didn't follow exactly what the Citizens' Assembly had proposed. And the Citizens' Assembly hadn't actually proposed anything that specific. But there was, people kind of went, oh, well, we would have all passed had they listened to the Citizens' Assembly. And there was, you get a sense that people kind of think that they have to be listened to. But I mean, clearly there's only 100 people, and these aren't normal people. The 100 people in the room are people, and you also get a lot of people falling away because, I don't think I could handle spending weekends thinking about
big commitment at times. Yeah.
So it probably is that the people who do stay there are people who have stronger opinions about this. So they're not really that normal, and they're not always that representative. But that said, it can still be a useful exercise, but not one that you kind of think is legitimate, and therefore we have to listen to that. It's probably something that can kind of set an agenda or give information to government and to parliamentarians. And so it's something that maybe just we listen to, but don't feel it's too directive.
So Eoin, last couple of questions from me, if I may. First one, we've spoken a lot about actually the use of assemblies and referenda at the national level for signature national issues. I just wondered that many of the issues that we face are local rather than national, and whether you could use the machinery of citizens' assemblies to tackle local issues as well. Indeed, maybe in some ways they're even better equipped to tackle local issues using local citizens' views. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, one of the major downsides of citizens' assemblies is that you've got a very small number of people in sometimes very, very big countries, and they don't have an impact beyond that, that 100 citizens, say. So it's not scalable, where you're not actually affecting many ordinary people. So if you're trying to fix democracy, it doesn't do that, because it's the 100 people love it, but everybody else doesn't really know that it's happening. Whereas at a local level, if you were, say, having 30 or 40 people thinking about some issues, for instance, in Northern Ireland, they were used on a new school in an area, and you had difficult issues about, should it be a Catholic school or a Protestant school or a non-denominational school, and you would have had people from both sides, from both communities in Northern Ireland, wanting their side to win. And the Citizens' Assembly process, that sort of deliberative process, worked quite well in that both sides got to hear the other side's problems and then would start to see issues from the other person's perspective. And so again, maybe in local decisions on, say, house building, whether we should, that field there is needed for playing fields, or whether it could accommodate some more housing. If you were to get to hear the different views, they will probably have more of an impact because it'll dissipate more into the community. So the discussions that are had in that kind of small citizen group are more likely to have an impact in that community. And also because at local level you do tend to have pretty concrete issues where you're forced to make decisions, and people know that there are those trade-offs. That if it's given to housing, it's not given to playing fields, for instance.
Yeah, very interesting and a very relevant contour of policy across here. I think we're probably moving in the direction of giving more powers to local leaders, and this might be a way of boosting their accountability. Last question. I promised the last question. What's been a really fascinating discussion. We started off talking about the very beginning about the fragility of our democracies, and you were very clear that that fragility was there in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have foreseen certainly a generation ago. But one of the values of the RSA that we've carried throughout our 270 years is optimism. Optimism about the future. I wonder if you could leave us, Eoin, with an optimistic thought or reflection on democracies and governance, how we act with courage to strengthen our democracies, maybe to avoid those fragilities you mentioned had built up. What could we do to put a spring in our step to make us feel good about democracy and indeed make it more resilient?
I mean, I think if we think about what are some of the weaknesses, what are the sources of some of the weaknesses, a lot of them come from, say, online misinformation, disinformation, things like that. You could see how one might use a deliberative process in some way that might enable people, instead of creating echo chambers or instead of polarizing because they're just throwing mud at each other, that we could think of how we might design some sort of facility or process which would enable us to allow citizens to talk to each other and disagree with each other without necessarily hating each other. And I think deliberative democracy can probably teach us some things about that, and we can see that digital democracy enables us to scale up, to allow lots of people to have a voice, because that once every 5 years thing isn't enough. And so we probably should be able to think about how could we use deliberation, that 100 people in the room, and how could we scale it up digitally to allow the 100,000 people or the 1 million people to talk to each other in some way that and enables them to kind of see the other side's perspective and to kind of see the perspective of the politician making difficult choices.
That's a fantastically uplifting and futuristic way to end. Eoin, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today on this massive signature issue for all of our economies and societies right now. I've hugely enjoyed it.
Thank you.